There's a hilltop. You wouldn't notice it if you passed by today. Just rocks, some grass, maybe a few broken stones half buried in the dirt. But if you dig down, just a few feet, you'll find arrowheads, broken swords, bones, thousands of bones. Because on this hill, a handful of men decided they would rather die than kneel. And an emperor, a man who'd conquered half the known world, who'd burned cities and toppled kingdoms, learned that some ground can't be taken, no matter how many soldiers you throw at it, no matter how much blood you're willing to spill. Picture this, a young defender, maybe 19 years old, standing on those walls. He hasn't slept in 3 days. His hands are shaking from exhaustion. Below him, he can see an army that stretches to the horizon, tens of thousands of men, siege towers, battering rams, banners from a dozen conquered nations. He knows he's going to die here. They all know. But here's what breaks your heart. He's not thinking about survival anymore. He's thinking about his little sister back home, about whether she'll remember him, about whether anyone will remember what they did here. That young man died on the 7th day of the siege, an arrow through the throat while he was carrying water to wounded friends. He never got a grave, never got a monument. His name is lost to history. But what he did, what they all did on that hilltop, changed everything. Because when that emperor finally retreated, when his unstoppable army limped away in defeat, the world learned something powerful. It doesn't matter how big your army is. It doesn't matter how many battles you've won. Some fights aren't about numbers. They're about will. And on that hilltop, a few hundred men had more will than an empire. This is the story of how a single hill stopped a conquering emperor, how geography became destiny, how desperate courage defeated overwhelming power, and why every soldier who died there, their names forgotten, their graves unmarked, deserves to be remembered. Stay with me, because what happened on this hilltop will make you question everything you thought you knew about warfare. And if you skip this story, you're walking past those bones without stopping, without acknowledging the sacrifice, without understanding the price they paid so you could learn what real courage looks like. 10 years before the siege, the emperor was nobody, just another ambitious warlord in a fractured land, fighting for scraps of territory, making alliances that lasted weeks before they crumbled into betrayal and blood. But he had something most commanders didn't: vision. Not just the dream of power, but a clear, methodical plan for how to achieve it. He started small, took villages that others ignored, built loyalty through shared victories rather than fear, trained his soldiers differently, emphasizing discipline over individual glory, coordinated tactics over brave charges. While other warlords were drinking in their halls, celebrating yesterday's victories, he was planning tomorrow's campaigns. Within 5 years, he'd unified the fractured provinces into a cohesive force. Within 7, he'd defeated the 3 major rival kingdoms that had dominated the region for centuries. By year 10, he was no longer a warlord. He was an emperor, and his army was the most feared military machine the region had ever seen. City after city fell before him. Some surrendered without a fight. The emperor's reputation alone was enough. Those that resisted were crushed with brutal efficiency. His siege engineers could break walls that had stood for generations. His cavalry could outmaneuver any force sent against them. His infantry was so well drilled they could execute complex battlefield maneuvers that other armies couldn't imagine. He seemed unstoppable, divinely favored, invincible. And then he reached the hilltop fortress. It wasn't even impressive, not really. No magnificent walls reaching toward the sky. No legendary defenses spoken of in songs. Just a modest fortification sitting atop a steep hill at a strategic crossroads. The hill itself was the real defense. Rocky, with only 2 narrow approaches, rising sharply from the surrounding plains. The fortress at its peak was simple stone construction, barely large enough to house 500 defenders. The emperor's advisors dismissed it as an inconvenience, not a threat. "We'll take it in 3 days," his chief general predicted. "Surrender once they see the size of our army." The emperor agreed. This was barely worth his attention. Just one more obstacle to sweep aside on the path to complete regional domination. Beyond this hill lay the wealthy eastern provinces, undefended, ripe for conquest. The hilltop fortress was all that stood between his army and total victory. He sent messengers up the hill with generous terms. Surrender now. Keep your lives. Even keep your positions of minor authority. Fight, and everyone dies. The defenders' response came back simple and clear. Come and take it. The emperor smiled when he heard this. He'd heard such bravado before, from kingdoms 10 times this fortress's size. They all fell eventually. They all learned that pride was a luxury you couldn't afford when facing his army. He gave the order to attack, expecting to be dining in the fortress hall by sunset. He had no idea he was about to experience his first defeat, or that this unremarkable hill would become his obsession, his nightmare, and ultimately, the end of his invincible reputation. The first assault was textbook. The emperor's engineers had studied the hill's approaches. They identified the 2 paths that could accommodate an attacking force, one on the eastern slope, one on the western. Both were narrow, barely wide enough for 10 men to advance side by side. Both climbed steeply, with loose rocks and limited footing. But his soldiers were experienced. They'd taken fortresses under worse conditions. At dawn, with drums beating and banners flying, 5,000 soldiers began the assault from both approaches simultaneously. The plan was simple: overwhelm the defenders with numbers, punch through the gates, secure the fortress by midday. The defenders waited until the attacking forces were halfway up the slopes. Committed. Too far to easily retreat, not close enough to threaten the walls. That's when they struck. Arrows first, not random volleys, but precisely aimed shots at the soldiers struggling with footing on the steep, rocky paths. Men fell, and their bodies became obstacles for those behind them. Then came the rocks. Defenders had spent weeks stockpiling stones, and now they sent them rolling down the slopes. On those narrow paths, there was nowhere to dodge. Soldiers were crushed, knocked off the paths into steep ravines, or simply forced to retreat to avoid the avalanche of stone. The assault broke within 2 hours. Hundreds dead, hundreds more injured. The fortress walls hadn't even been touched. The emperor was furious but not concerned. First assaults often failed. It meant nothing. He ordered his engineers to build siege towers, wooden structures that would allow soldiers to reach the fortress walls without having to fight their way up the narrow approaches. But the hilltop's geography betrayed him again. The slopes were too steep and rocky for wheeled siege equipment. His engineers tried for 3 days to find a path that could accommodate a siege tower. They couldn't. The hill that seemed like a minor obstacle was proving to be a natural fortress that negated all of his technological advantages. Fine. If siege equipment couldn't reach them, he'd starve them out. The emperor's army encircled the hill completely. No supplies in or out. The defenders had food and water for perhaps a month, his scouts estimated. After that, starvation would force surrender. The emperor was patient. He could wait. But as days turned to weeks, strange things began happening. His supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of conquered territory, started facing attacks. Small raiding parties hitting supply convoys, destroying food stores, ambushing messengers. The emperor's army was massive, which meant it consumed enormous quantities of food daily. Those supplies had to come from somewhere, and someone was systematically disrupting the flow. Local resistance forces, emboldened by the hilltop's unexpected resilience, were striking back. The emperor's unstoppable reputation was cracking, and rebels throughout the region were taking note. Still, the emperor remained confident. The defenders couldn't hold forever. So he waited, and ordered his generals to prepare for another assault. The second major attack came 3 weeks into the siege. This time, the emperor committed 15,000 soldiers, 3 times the number of the first assault. He personally supervised the planning. They would attack at night, using the darkness to mask their movements until they were close to the walls. They would use ladders instead of siege towers, dozens of teams carrying scaling ladders, hitting multiple points on the fortress walls simultaneously. It was a brilliant plan. It should have worked. The defenders were waiting. They'd observed the army's preparations, guessed the strategy. When the assault came in darkness, they were ready with burning oil, torches that turned night into day, and coordinated defense that threw back every scaling attempt. Soldiers who managed to reach the walls found themselves in brutal hand-to-hand combat with defenders who were fighting not just for survival, but for their homes, their families, their freedom. The night attack lasted 6 hours. It was carnage. Bodies piled at the base of the walls. Ladders burned. Soldiers trapped on the narrow approaches couldn't retreat effectively and were cut down by the hundreds. By dawn, the emperor had lost over 2,000 men. The fortress remained secure. The defenders had suffered fewer than 100 casualties. The emperor's generals began whispering among themselves. Some suggested withdrawing, bypassing the fortress, leaving a small force to contain it while the main army moved on to easier targets. But the emperor refused. His pride wouldn't allow it. He'd never retreated from anything. He'd never left a conquest unfinished. This hilltop was mocking him, and he could not, walk away. So he ordered a third assault, then a fourth, then a fifth. Each one failed. Each one cost hundreds or thousands of lives. Each one left the fortress standing and the defenders, though exhausted and bleeding, still defiant. By the 6th week, everything had changed. The emperor's army, once proud and confident, was now demoralized. Soldiers whispered about the hilltop being cursed, about the defenders having supernatural protection. Morale collapsed. Desertion rates climbed. The regional supply lines were in chaos, with resistance attacks escalating daily. Food shortages began affecting the siege camp. Disease broke out. Cramped conditions, poor sanitation, and falling morale created perfect conditions for illness to spread. The weather turned against them too. Early winter storms rolled in, unseasonably harsh, bringing freezing rain and snow. The siege camp, sprawling across the plains below the hill, became a nightmare of mud and cold. Soldiers who'd survived battles were dying of exposure and sickness. The supply situation worsened as storms made roads impassable. Meanwhile, the defenders endured. Yes, they were suffering, exhausted, wounded, running low on arrows and food. But they were inside stone walls with roofs over their heads. They had working wells for water. And most importantly, they had hope. Every day they held was another day the emperor looked weaker. Another day that resistance forces throughout the region gained strength. Another day that proved the emperor was mortal after all. The final assault came on the 43rd day of the siege. The emperor, desperate now, committed everything. 20,000 soldiers in a coordinated attack from all approaches simultaneously. He would take that fortress or destroy his army trying. His reputation, his empire, his entire legacy depended on breaking these defenders who'd made him look like a fool. The attack began at dawn. Wave after wave of soldiers throwing themselves at the narrow approaches, at the walls, at every possible weakness in the defenses. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, fought with the desperation of men who knew this was the final test. They had no reserves left, no tricks, just courage and the will to hold one more time. The fighting was apocalyptic. Men fought hand-to-hand on the walls. Defenders threw everything they had, rocks, broken furniture, their own bodies, at the attackers. Multiple sections of the outer wall were breached. Imperial soldiers made it inside the fortress compound for the first time. For a brief moment, it seemed like the emperor would finally achieve victory. But the defenders refused to break. They fell back to inner defensive positions. They fought in courtyards, in doorways, in corridors. They turned every room into a battleground. Young men who'd never held a sword before the siege became hardened fighters. Women who'd been cooking supplies took up fallen weapons, grinding combat where every foot of ground was bought with blood. And then, as the sun began to set, something extraordinary happened. The imperial assault broke. Not because of a brilliant tactic or a devastating counterattack. It broke because the soldiers, exhausted, demoralized, horrified by the casualties, simply stopped advancing. Officers screamed orders that went ignored. Soldiers dropped their weapons and retreated. Some sat down where they stood, too tired to care anymore if they lived or died. The defenders had held. Barely. They were bloodied, battered, down to their last arrows and their last reserves of strength. But they'd held. That night, the emperor made a decision that would echo through history. He ordered a retreat. The siege was over. The hilltop had won. The army that limped away from the hilltop fortress was not the same force that had arrived 6 weeks earlier. They'd lost over 8,000 men, dead, wounded, or deserted. They left behind siege equipment, supplies, weapons, and the shattered remains of their invincible reputation. The emperor himself was a changed man. Gone was the confident, almost divine figure who'd swept across the region. In his place was a humbled, aging warrior who'd learned that willpower could defeat numbers and that natural defenses were sometimes insurmountable. The retreat wasn't orderly. It was a defeated army slinking away from a fortress that should have fallen in days. Word spread fast. By the time the emperor's forces reached friendly territory, the entire region knew what had happened. The unstoppable emperor had been stopped. By a hilltop, by a few hundred defenders who refused to surrender. Rebellions erupted across the empire. Territories that had been conquered rose up, emboldened by the proof that the emperor could be beaten. His supply lines, already damaged during the siege, collapsed entirely as local forces attacked with new confidence. Allied states that had pledged loyalty out of fear began reconsidering their positions. The empire's expansion ended at that hilltop, not with a catastrophic battle or a dramatic defeat, but with a grinding siege that proved the emperor was mortal, that his army could fail, that determination and geography could overcome overwhelming force. The emperor tried to rebuild his momentum. He launched other campaigns, won some battles, but it was never the same. The aura of invincibility was gone. His soldiers questioned orders. His generals hesitated before committing to assaults. The psychological warfare he'd mastered, the fear that preceded his armies, was broken. He'd become just another commander, capable of defeat like anyone else. He never attacked another hilltop fortress. Some say the memory haunted him, that he dreamed of those walls, of defenders who wouldn't break, of the face of the young commander who'd refused his surrender terms. The defenders became legends. Songs were written about them. Their commander, a minor noble who'd been governing a backwater fortress, was elevated to hero status. Statues were erected. The fortress itself became a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to remember what courage looked like when everything was on the line. But here's what history often forgets. Most of those defenders died in the final assault. They held, yes, but at terrible cost. The young man I told you about in the beginning was real. So were the hundreds like him. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances who chose to stand and fight rather than kneel and live. The fortress commander survived, but he never celebrated the victory. Friends said he was different afterward, haunted by the faces of those who died under his command. He'd visit the mass grave where defenders were buried, those who could be identified and those who couldn't, and just sit there for hours, saying nothing. He understood what many didn't. They'd won, yes. They'd stopped an emperor. But the price had been measured in lives that could never be replaced, in young men and women who'd had futures that were stolen by necessity and war. The hilltop still stands. The fortress has crumbled over the centuries, reduced to those broken stones I mentioned at the beginning. But if you visit, and some still do, you can see why it was so formidable. The steep slopes, the limited approaches, the commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Nature built a fortress there long before humans added walls. And if you're quiet, if you listen, some say, you can still hear echoes of that final assault. The clash of weapons, the screams of dying men, the desperate courage of defenders making their last stand. It's probably just wine through the rocks. But maybe, just maybe, it's memory refusing to let go, refusing to let us forget what happened there. So what does this mean? Why does this story matter? Because it teaches us something that empires always forget and that every generation has to relearn. Power isn't absolute. Numbers aren't everything. Technology and training and resources can all be negated by geography, determination, and the willingness to pay any price for freedom. That emperor commanded armies that had crushed kingdoms. He had resources that seemed infinite, experience that spanned decades, tactical brilliance that had won 100 battles. And he lost to a hilltop defended by people who simply refused to quit. Think about that. Really think about it. Every soldier in that fortress knew they were probably going to die. They weren't stupid. They could count. They could see that army spread across the plains below them. An ocean of soldiers, siege equipment, cavalry, everything that represented military power in that era. Mathematically, they should have surrendered. Logically, resistance was pointless. But they fought anyway. Not because they thought they'd win, but because some things matter more than survival. Home matters. Freedom matters. The right to stand on your own ground and say no to an emperor matters. And here's the beautiful, heartbreaking part. They were right. Their sacrifice, and make no mistake, it was a sacrifice, changed history. The emperor's expansion ended there. The empire began to crack. Regions gained courage to resist. The balance of power shifted. One hilltop, a few hundred people, and the entire direction of history changed. The young defender I keep coming back to, the one carrying water when he died. He was somebody's son, probably somebody's brother, maybe somebody's young love back home, waiting for him to return. He had dreams that went beyond war, plans for after the siege ended, a future he'd imagined. He gave all of that up, not dramatically, not in some glorious final charge that would be remembered in songs. He died doing a mundane task, carrying water, while arrows rained down and his friends died around him and the world burned. That's real heroism, not the fantasy version. The real, messy, heartbreaking version where good people die badly and history barely remembers their names. We owe them memory. We owe them understanding. We owe them the acknowledgement that what they did mattered, even if most of the world has forgotten. Because that hilltop, those bones buried in that ground, they're proof of something powerful. You don't have to be an empire to make history. You don't need vast armies or legendary weapons or divine favor. Sometimes all you need is the will to stand when everyone expects you to kneel. The courage to fight when logic says you should surrender. The stubborn, irrational, magnificent human ability to look at impossible odds and say not today. The emperor learned that lesson the hard way. It cost him his reputation, his momentum, and eventually his empire. The defenders paid an even higher price. But they proved something that needed proving. They showed that geography can be destiny, that willpower can overcome numbers, and that sometimes a single hill really can stop a conquering emperor. Their names are mostly lost to time. Their individual stories forgotten. But what they did together, that lives on. In every military academy that studies defensive warfare. In every rebellion that takes heart from their example. In every person who hears this story and understands that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and standing anyway. The hilltop is quiet now. Just wind and grass and those broken stones. But beneath it all, the bones remain. Silent witnesses to one of history's most improbable victories. Proof that some ground can't be taken. Some people can't be conquered. Some prices are too high, even for an emperor. And that's a lesson worth remembering. Carved not in monuments or songs, but in the earth itself, in a hilltop that stopped an empire and the forgotten heroes who made it possible. They died there. All those young men and women with dreams and futures and families waiting. The least we can do is tell their story. The least we can do is stop at that hilltop, whether physically or in our minds, and acknowledge the sacrifice, the pain, the loss, the desperate, beautiful, heartbreaking courage that changed the world. Because they're still there, beneath the grass and the stones. Still standing watch. Still refusing to kneel. Still teaching us that some fights are worth dying for. Even when you know you probably won't survive to see the victory you're fighting for. That's the legacy of the hilltop. That's the lesson of the siege. And that's why we remember.